Welcome, wanderer of the wasteland, to the tale of a mountain among men, a shadow cast in power armor across the broken world. Tonight we chronicle the complete saga of Frank Horrigan, from loyal servant to ultimate weapon, from human ambition to mechanical nightmare. This is the story of the Enclave's greatest creation and most terrifying enforcer, a man transformed by science and loyalty into something beyond human understanding. So settle into comfort, let your breathing slow, and drift with us through the decades as we explore every chapter of the monster who became the face of absolute authority in a world gone mad. The year 2211 marked not just another passage of time in the wasteland's endless calendar of survival, but the birth of a child who would grow to embody the very contradictions that defined post-nuclear America. In a world where clean water was currency and untainted blood was mythology, Frank Horrigan entered existence as what his people would call pure, unmarked by the radiation that had reshaped humanity in ways both subtle and grotesque. But purity, in the broken landscape of the 23rd century, was not a blessing so much as a burden waiting to be claimed. The Enclave had survived the Great War not through luck or divine providence, but through the kind of meticulous planning that only paranoia and unlimited resources could provide. Hidden away on their oil rig fortress miles off the California coast, they had watched the mainland burn and then slowly heal, documenting every mutation, cataloging every adaptation, and growing more disgusted with each passing decade at what humanity had become in their absence. They were the inheritors of old world values, the keepers of pure human genetic material, and increasingly, the judges of who deserved to continue breathing in their vision of tomorrow. Into this isolated world of scientific precision and ideological certainty, Frank Horrigan was born to parents whose names history would forget, but whose genetic contribution would shape the wasteland's future in ways they could never have imagined. His mother, a research technician whose loyalty to the Enclave had earned her a place among the breeding population, carried him through a pregnancy monitored with the same attention typically reserved for critical experiments. His father, a security officer whose own impressive physical specimens had recommended him for reproductive duties, provided the genetic foundation for what would become a monument to human potential, twisted toward darker purposes. From his earliest days, Frank displayed the characteristics that would define his adult existence. Where other infants required careful handling, Frank's grip could leave marks on adult fingers. Where children his age stumbled through their first steps, Frank moved with a coordination that suggested strength waiting to unfold. His growth charts became subjects of fascination among Enclave medical staff, who documented his development with the same precision they applied to their weapons research and genetic modification projects. The oil rig that served as Frank's childhood home was a marvel of pre-war engineering maintained through post-war dedication, a floating city where every citizen served the greater purpose of preserving true American values in a world gone mad with mutation and chaos. Corridors hummed with the sound of advanced technology. Laboratories buzzed with research that would have seemed like magic to mainland survivors, and every surface gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that only unlimited energy and fanatical dedication could maintain. Frank's education began before he could properly speak, with lessons delivered through advanced computer systems that taught him history, mathematics, science, and most importantly, the moral framework that would guide his adult decisions. He learned about the great American experiment, about the founding fathers who had envisioned a nation of free and pure citizens, about the communist threat that had ultimately destroyed the old world through nuclear fire. But more than historical facts, he absorbed the emotional truth that would drive his life. that purity was worth preserving, that strength was meant to serve righteousness, and that sometimes preservation required elimination of contamination. The other children on the rig served as Frank's first measuring stick for his own exceptional nature. In playground games, he moved faster and struck harder than boys years older than himself. In classroom competitions, he demonstrated not just intelligence, but the kind of focused determination that made his instructors take note and file reports that would eventually reach the highest levels of Enclave leadership. But perhaps most importantly, young Frank showed an emotional detachment that made violence seem natural rather than traumatic, a characteristic that would prove invaluable in the career path already being planned for him. Physical training began early for all Enclave children, but Frank's regimen was modified almost from the start to accommodate his exceptional capabilities and prepare him for the role he seemed destined to fill. Where other children learned basic self-defense, Frank mastered combat techniques that would have challenged adult soldiers. Where others practiced with training weapons, Frank was introduced to real firearms and bladed weapons. Under the guidance of instructors who recognized they were shaping something unprecedented. By his 15th birthday, Frank stood taller than most adult men and possessed strength that seemed to violate normal human limitations. His instructors reported that he could lift weights that strained the oil rig's exercise equipment, that his reflexes bordered on superhuman, and that his pain tolerance suggested either exceptional mental discipline or a nervous system that simply processed discomfort differently than normal humans. But more than his physical gifts, Frank displayed a psychological profile that made him ideal for the kind of work the Enclave needed done in an increasingly hostile world. The transition from childhood to adolescence brought with it more specialized training as Frank's destiny became increasingly clear to those who guided his development. He was introduced to advanced weapons systems, sophisticated surveillance equipment, and most importantly, the psychological techniques that would enable him to function as both protector and eliminator without the emotional complications that plagued lesser agents. His trainers noted his ability to compartmentalize violence, to perform necessary actions without the guilt or hesitation that might compromise operational effectiveness. Intelligence tests revealed that Frank's mental capabilities had developed alongside his physical gifts, creating a combination of power and intelligence that promised exceptional utility in the field operations that the Enclave was beginning to plan. He could analyze tactical situations with the precision of a trained soldier, adapt to changing circumstances with the flexibility of a natural survivor, and most crucially, follow orders with the absolute loyalty that made him trustworthy with the most sensitive missions. Frank's first exposure to mainland reality came through carefully curated intelligence reports and surveillance footage that documented the degraded state of post-war humanity. He saw communities of ghouls shuffling through ruined cities, super mutants ruling through brute force, and normal humans scraping out subsistence-level existence in conditions that would have been considered intolerable even before the war. These images reinforced the lessons he had learned about purity and contamination, about the necessity of strong leadership, and about the tragic consequences of allowing genetic degradation to spread unchecked. The Secret Service recruitment that came with Frank's 18th birthday was less an offer than a recognition of inevitability. His size, loyalty, and capacity for violence had marked him for this path since childhood, and his acceptance was never in question. The oath he swore to President Richardson was not just a professional commitment, but a religious dedication to preserving everything pure and right in a world that had lost its way through weakness and compromise. Frank's early assignments tested his capabilities while demonstrating his value to the organization that had shaped him since birth. Intelligence gathering on mainland settlements revealed his ability to move unseen despite his size, to observe without being detected, and to eliminate threats without leaving evidence that might complicate Enclave operations. Each successful mission added to his reputation within the organization and reinforced the trust that his superiors placed in his judgment and effectiveness. The psychological evaluations that accompanied Frank's rise through the Secret Service ranks painted a picture of an ideal agent, intelligent enough to understand complex situations, loyal enough to follow orders without question, and emotionally detached enough to perform necessary actions without the kind of moral complications that might compromise mission success. His evaluators noted his complete identification with Enclave values, his absolute faith in the righteousness of their cause, and his willingness to pay any personal price to ensure their ultimate victory. But perhaps most significantly, Frank's early career demonstrated his capacity to rationalize violence not as a necessary evil, but as a positive good when directed toward the right targets. His reports from mainland operations showed no remorse for eliminated threats, no hesitation about collateral damage, and no concern about the human cost of Enclave objectives. He had internalized their values so completely that violence in service of purity seemed not just justified, but morally required. The mysterious incident that would reshape Frank's career came during what should have been a routine protection assignment. Though the exact details remain classified in Enclave records that survived the oil rig's eventual destruction. What is known is that Frank's psychological profile, previously characterized by perfect emotional control, showed signs of what his evaluators termed a psychotic blunder, an episode of violence or judgment so extreme that it forced his superiors to reconsider his suitability for close proximity to the president and other high-ranking officials. Some evidence suggests that Frank's blunder involved the death of a fellow agent or support staff member, possibly someone who had questioned an order or expressed doubt about Enclave methods. Other accounts hint at an overreaction to a perceived threat, a situation where Frank's capacity for violence exceeded even the Enclave's considerable tolerance for necessary brutality. Whatever the specifics, the incident marked a turning point in Frank's career and ultimately in the Wastelands' history. The reassignment that followed was presented as a lateral transfer rather than a demotion, but Frank's move from presidential protection to wasteland patrol represented a fundamental shift in his role within the organization. Where he had once been trusted with the most sensitive diplomatic and security functions, he was now assigned to the dangerous and unglamorous work of scouting, intelligence gathering, and elimination of external threats. The change would prove to be more significant than anyone could have imagined. Frank's new assignment took him away from the sterile corridors of the oil rig and into direct contact with the contaminated world that the Enclave sought to reclaim. His patrol duties required extended periods on the mainland, breathing unfiltered air, drinking processed water, and experiencing firsthand the degraded conditions that mainland survivors accepted as normal. These experiences reinforced his belief in Enclave superiority while exposing him to the very contamination that his organization sought to eliminate. The irony of Frank's situation was lost on him in those early days of patrol duty. He moved through the wasteland as a representative of genetic purity, while unknowingly absorbing the radiation and environmental toxins that would eventually transform him into the very thing his people considered subhuman. His loyalty remained absolute, his dedication unwavering, and his faith in the Enclave mission stronger than ever, even as the seeds of his eventual mutation were taking root in his cells. Frank's patrol reports from this period reveal a man growing increasingly impatient with the Enclave's cautious approach to mainland operations. He documented settlement locations, resource deposits, and potential threats with mechanical precision. But his observations consistently recommended more aggressive action. He saw weakness where others saw potential allies, contamination where others saw adaptation, and targets where others saw obstacles to be circumvented rather than eliminated. The patrol work also revealed Frank's growing disconnect from normal human empathy as he observed mainland life without seeing humanity worth preserving. His reports described wasteland communities in clinical terms that stripped away any consideration of their hopes, fears, or basic dignity. They were subjects for observation, resources for potential exploitation, or threats for eventual elimination, but never fellow human beings deserving of consideration or mercy. As Frank's patrol duties extended into months and then years, the man who had once been the Enclave's perfect agent was unknowingly being transformed by forces beyond his control or understanding. The radiation exposure that was an inevitable consequence of extended mainland operations began to work changes in his genetic structure that would not become apparent for years, but would ultimately reshape not just his physical form, his entire destiny. The Frank Horrigan who emerged from this period of patrol duty was harder, colder, and more dangerous than the already formidable young man who had begun the assignment. His experiences in the wasteland had confirmed every prejudice about mainland humanity while reinforcing his absolute commitment to the Enclave's vision of purification through elimination. He returned to base with recommendations for total war, convinced that negotiation or coexistence with the contaminated masses was not just impossible, but morally wrong. But Frank's transformation was only beginning, and the forces already at work in his body would soon make him the perfect symbol of everything the Enclave claimed to oppose, even as his loyalty to their cause remained unshakable. The man who had been created to preserve human purity was about to become the ultimate argument for why purity might be impossible to maintain, in a world where survival required adaptation to conditions that changed the very definition of what it meant to be human. The story of the Enclave begins not with the bombs falling, but with the shadows that preceded them, the secret machinations of men who understood that power was never truly given up, but merely relocated to places where it could wait for more favorable circumstances. In the decades before the Great War, when most Americans went about their daily lives believing in the democratic ideals that governed their nation, a different form of government was already taking shape beneath the surface of official Washington, a deep state apparatus that would outlive the country it claimed to serve. The roots of this shadow organization stretched back through generations of American politics, drawing together threads of corporate influence, military authority, and political ambition that had always existed but had never before been woven into such a comprehensive web of control. Former presidents whose public service had ended, but whose private influence continued to shape policy. Sitting presidents who recognized that some decisions were too important to be left to the vagaries of democratic process. Corporate leaders whose wealth and industrial capacity made them indispensable to national security. Military commanders whose understanding of global threats exceeded anything the public was prepared to comprehend. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, shared certain fundamental beliefs that transcended party affiliation or ideological differences. They believed that America represented humanity's best hope for organized civilization. They believed that the general population, while deserving of protection, lacked the wisdom and strength necessary to make the hard decisions that leadership required. Most importantly, they believed that preserving American values and American genetic stock was worth any sacrifice, any compromise, any action that circumstances might demand. The organization they created operated without official recognition, without public oversight, and without the moral constraints that bound those who worked in the light of democratic accountability. They called themselves the Enclave, a name that suggested both exclusivity and protective isolation, a circle of the worthy defending essential truths from those too weak or contaminated to understand their value. Their membership was limited, their methods were secret, and their resources were vast, beyond the comprehension of ordinary citizens who funded their operations through taxes directed toward programs that existed only on paper. Throughout the 21st century, as international tensions escalated and the specter of nuclear war grew from distant possibility to immediate probability, the Enclave's preparations intensified with the methodical precision that unlimited resources and advanced intelligence could provide. They understood better than anyone that the conflict between America and China was not a temporary diplomatic crisis, but an inevitable collision between incompatible visions of human organization. When that collision came, as they knew it must, they intended to survive it with their values, their genetic heritage, and their vision of proper leadership intact. The Poseidon oil platform that became the Enclave's primary sanctuary was officially a private energy extraction facility, but its true purpose was evident to anyone who understood how to read between the lines of classified procurement records and military engineering contracts. Located miles off the California coast, far enough from potential nuclear targets to avoid immediate destruction but close enough to the mainland to enable eventual intervention, the platform represented the kind of long-term strategic thinking that characterized everything the Enclave attempted. Construction of the platform's defensive and life support systems proceeded under cover of routine industrial expansion, with materials and personnel diverted from legitimate projects to create what amounted to a floating city capable of sustaining a small population through decades of isolation. The platform's designers incorporated advanced water purification systems, hydroponic agricultural facilities, comprehensive medical research laboratories, and most importantly, the kind of nuclear shielding and air filtration that would enable survival even in the aftermath of global atomic exchange. The selection process that determined who would earn passage to the platform when the inevitable war began reflected the Enclave's core beliefs about human worth and genetic value. Military leaders whose loyalty had been tested through years of classified operations, scientists whose research contributed to national security objectives while maintaining appropriate political perspectives, corporate executives whose wealth and industrial knowledge would be essential for post-war reconstruction, political figures whose families had served American interests for generations without the moral flexibility that democratic politics typically required, but perhaps most carefully chosen were the support personnel whose genetic profiles promised the kind of healthy offspring that would be necessary for rebuilding American civilization after the contaminated masses had been eliminated or died off naturally. The Enclave understood that survival was only the first step in a longer process of restoration, and that restoration would require breeding stock capable of producing the kind of pure human specimens that represented America's true potential. When the bombs finally fell on October 23rd, 2077, the Enclave's preparations proved their worth in ways that exceeded even their most optimistic projections. The platform's defensive systems functioned flawlessly, protecting their population from the electromagnetic pulses, radiation clouds, and social chaos that destroyed less prepared communities. Their advanced intelligence networks provided accurate information about the scope of destruction, the survival rates of various military installations, and most importantly, the rapid degradation of genetic quality among mainland survivors. The decades that followed the Great War were not a period of mere survival for the Enclave, but an era of careful observation, methodical planning, and gradual preparation for their eventual emergence as the rightful rulers of whatever remained of American territory. They monitored radio transmissions from mainland communities, documenting the rise of raider gangs, the formation of primitive trading networks, and the gradual mutation of human populations exposed to radiation and environmental toxins. Each piece of intelligence confirmed their fundamental assumptions about the necessity of their mission and the righteousness of their eventual actions. President Richardson's assumption of leadership marked not a change in the Enclave's direction, but an acceleration of plans that had been developing for decades. Richardson embodied everything the organization valued: genetic purity, unwavering commitment to American ideals, and the kind of moral clarity that enabled decisive action without the paralysis that affected lesser leaders. His vision of post-war America was simultaneously nostalgic and revolutionary, seeking to restore the country's greatness while eliminating the weaknesses that had allowed it to be destroyed in the first place. Under Richardson's guidance, the Enclave's research programs expanded beyond mere survival technology to encompass the kind of advanced scientific projects that would enable them to reshape the post-war world according to their specifications. Power armor development progressed from pre-war prototypes to fully functional combat systems that would give their forces overwhelming advantages over any opposition they might encounter. Genetic research explored the possibilities of both purifying contaminated populations and enhancing the capabilities of pure human specimens. Most significantly, weapons research focused on developing tools that could eliminate large populations while preserving infrastructure and resources for eventual enclave use. The philosophical framework that guided these research efforts reflected the Enclave's fundamental belief that post-war conditions required post-war solutions unconstrained by pre-war moral limitations. The democratic ideals that had governed America before the bombs fell were luxuries that a damaged world could no longer afford. Compassion for the genetically inferior was sentiment that endangered the survival of the genetically superior. Negotiation with contaminated populations was collaboration with the very forces that threatened human extinction. Frank Horrigan's early career within this environment was shaped by exposure to these ideas during their most fully developed form, when decades of isolation had refined the Enclave's worldview into a comprehensive ideology that explained everything while justifying anything. He absorbed their teachings not as abstract philosophy, but as practical guidance for understanding his place in the world and his responsibilities to the future they were working to create. His loyalty was not just professional obligation, but religious devotion to a cause that transcended individual concerns. The oil rig that served as the Enclave's headquarters during Frank's formative years was simultaneously a marvel of pre-war engineering and a monument to post-war determination. A facility where every system had been maintained at peak efficiency through decades of careful stewardship and unlimited resources. The corridors where Frank walked daily hummed with advanced technology that mainland survivors could not have comprehended. Laboratories where research proceeded according to standards that pre-war universities could not have matched, and command centers where decisions were made that would eventually reshape the entire North American continent. Living within this environment of technological superiority and ideological certainty provided Frank with a perspective on the post-war world that few mainland survivors could have understood or accepted. He saw the Enclave not as one faction among many, but as the legitimate government of America, temporarily displaced, but preparing to reclaim their rightful authority. He viewed mainland populations not as fellow humans struggling to survive, but as contaminated masses whose continued existence threatened the restoration of proper civilization. The intelligence reports that crossed Frank's desk during his Secret Service career provided a comprehensive picture of mainland conditions that reinforced every assumption about the necessity of the Enclave's mission. Communities of ghouls whose radiation-induced mutations made them barely recognizable as human. Super mutant populations whose strength was matched only by their stupidity and brutality. raider gangs whose casual violence demonstrated the complete breakdown of moral authority. Even the supposedly peaceful settlements showed signs of genetic degradation, cultural decay, and moral compromise that marked them as obstacles to restoration, rather than populations worthy of preservation. Frank's training in intelligence analysis taught him to see patterns that others might miss, connections that revealed the underlying truth about post-war survival. The strongest communities were typically those that maintained the strictest standards about genetic purity and cultural integrity. The most successful leaders were invariably those who understood that compassion was a luxury that survival could not afford. The most stable societies were built around hierarchies that reflected natural differences in capability and worth, rather than democratic fantasies about equality and universal human dignity. These lessons were reinforced through practical experience, as Frank's duties brought him into direct contact with the realities of post-war existence. His surveillance missions revealed the squalid conditions that mainland populations accepted as normal. His intelligence-gathering operations documented the primitive technologies that represented the best efforts of contaminated minds working with degraded materials. His elimination assignments demonstrated the pathetic resistance that even the strongest mainland specimens could offer against properly trained and equipped Enclave personnel. But perhaps most importantly, Frank's early career taught him to see violence not as a necessary evil, but as a positive good when properly directed toward appropriate targets. The elimination of genetic inferiors was not murder but mercy, sparing them from lives of suffering while protecting the genetic heritage of humanity. The destruction of contaminated communities was not genocide but sanitation, clearing space for proper civilization to take root and flourish. The imposition of Enclave authority was not conquest but restoration, returning America to the hands of those qualified to lead it. The psychological conditioning that accompanied Frank's professional development was designed to eliminate the kind of moral squeamishness that might interfere with mission effectiveness. He learned to compartmentalize empathy, reserving it for those who shared his genetic and ideological heritage, while withholding it from those marked by contamination or moral compromise. He developed the emotional detachment necessary to perform elimination operations without the guilt or hesitation that plagued inferior agents. Most crucially, he internalized the understanding that individual conscience was subordinate to organizational wisdom, that personal feelings were less important than collective objectives. Frank's worldview during this period was shaped by absolute certainty about the righteousness of the Enclave's cause and the necessity of their methods. He had been raised within a community of the genetically pure, educated according to principles that had preserved American ideals through humanity's darkest period, and trained by leaders whose wisdom had enabled survival when lesser men had perished in nuclear fire. His loyalty was not blind obedience, but informed commitment to the only organization capable of restoring proper order to a world gone mad with mutation and moral decay. The assignments that tested Frank's capabilities while preparing him for greater responsibilities revealed both his exceptional competence and his complete identification with Enclave values. Intelligence operations that required infiltration of mainland communities demonstrated his ability to function among the contaminated without being corrupted by their influence. Elimination missions that targeted specific threats to Enclave interests showed his capacity for precise violence, uncomplicated by unnecessary moral considerations. Protection duties that placed him in proximity to the organization's most sensitive operations confirmed his absolute trustworthiness with information that could compromise their ultimate objectives. As Frank's reputation within the organization grew, so did the scope of the responsibilities entrusted to him and the sensitivity of the operations in which he participated. He was no longer just another agent, but a key component in the machinery of Enclave power. A man whose exceptional capabilities made him indispensable for the most critical aspects of their long-term planning. His physical presence alone was sufficient to intimidate most potential sources of opposition, while his demonstrated loyalty made him suitable for assignments that required absolute discretion and unwavering commitment. The Enclave's vision of post-war America during Frank's early career was simultaneously ambitious and practical, encompassing not just the elimination of contaminated populations, but the complete reconstruction of American civilization according to principles that had been corrupted by democratic weakness and liberal sentimentality. They imagined cities rebuilt with proper attention to genetic segregation and cultural purity. They envisioned industries restored under the guidance of leaders who understood that efficiency was more important than worker comfort. They planned educational systems that would teach proper values without the moral relativism that had weakened pre-war society. But achieving this vision would require more than just superior technology and organizational skill. It would demand the kind of absolute commitment that Frank embodied, the willingness to perform any action and accept any sacrifice that the restoration of proper civilization might require. The Enclave's leadership understood that their agent's exceptional loyalty and capability made him uniquely qualified for the most difficult aspects of their mission: the elimination operations and intimidation campaigns that would clear the way for their emergence as the rightful rulers of post-war America. Frank's role within this grand design was both honored and essential, marking him as one of the chosen few qualified to participate in humanity's most important undertaking. His assignment to wasteland patrol duties would expose him to conditions that tested his commitment, while preparing him for the transformation that would make him the perfect instrument of Enclave will. The organization that had shaped him since birth was about to discover whether their creation was strong enough to survive the forces that would remake him into something beyond their original design. The ruins of Mariposa military base stood like a broken tooth against the wasteland sky, its twisted metal and collapsed concrete bearing witness to the dual catastrophes that had shaped its history. First destroyed by the Great War's atomic fire, then shattered again by the Vault Dwellers' explosives. The facility had become a monument to humanity's capacity for both scientific ambition and spectacular failure. But beneath the rubble and radiation, something far more dangerous than unexploded ordnance waited in the darkness: barrels of forced evolutionary virus that would transform the already nightmarish landscape of post-war America into something even more twisted and unrecognizable. The Enclave's discovery of Mariposa in 2236 was not accidental, but the result of systematic intelligence gathering and historical research that had occupied their best minds for decades. They understood better than anyone the significance of pre-war biological weapons research, the potential value of surviving scientific materials, and most importantly, the strategic advantages that advanced biotechnology could provide in their planned conquest of the contaminated mainland. The ruins represented not just archaeological curiosity, but operational opportunity on a scale that could reshape their entire approach to post-war reconstruction. President Richardson's authorization of the Mariposa excavation project reflected his understanding that the Enclave's technological superiority, while substantial, might not be sufficient to overcome the sheer numbers of mutated humans, ghouls, and super mutants that infested the territories they intended to reclaim. Traditional military action, even with their advanced power armor and energy weapons, would be costly and time-consuming when applied to the systematic elimination of millions of contaminated individuals. But biological warfare offered the possibility of efficient, large-scale population reduction with minimal risk to Enclave personnel and resources. The initial survey teams that descended into the Mariposa ruins reported conditions that exceeded even the Enclave's pessimistic expectations about the site's habitability and safety. Radiation levels throughout the facility remained lethal, decades after the explosions that had collapsed most of the surface structures. Toxic gases seeped from fractured chemical storage tanks, creating atmospheric conditions that would kill unprotected humans within minutes of exposure. Most ominously, strange mutations had taken root in the ruins. Plants that glowed with their own light, insects the size of small mammals, and bacterial colonies that seemed to feed on radiation itself. But buried beneath layers of rubble and radioactive debris, the survey teams found exactly what the Enclave's scientists had hoped to discover: intact storage containers holding samples of the forced evolutionary virus that had been the focus of pre-war military biological research. The virus itself represented one of humanity's most ambitious and terrifying scientific achievements, a compound designed to accelerate human evolution through controlled mutation while theoretically preserving intelligence and extending lifespan. The reality, as the master's experiments had demonstrated, was far more complex and horrifying than the original researchers had anticipated. The decision to begin full-scale excavation of the Mariposa site required careful consideration of the risks involved and the resources necessary to make the operation successful. The Enclave's leadership understood that exposing their personnel to the extreme radiation and toxic conditions within the ruins could result in casualties that their small population could not easily absorb. But they also recognized that the potential strategic value of recovered FEV samples justified extraordinary measures and acceptable losses in pursuit of what could be the key to their ultimate victory. Frank Horrigan's assignment to oversee the excavation operation reflected both his exceptional capabilities and the trust that his superiors placed in his judgment and loyalty. The mission required someone capable of maintaining discipline among personnel, working under extremely hazardous conditions, managing the complex logistics of extracting materials from a dangerous and unstable environment, and most importantly, ensuring that security remained absolute despite the presence of enslaved mainland labor, whose loyalty could never be assumed or trusted. The use of captured wastelanders as manual labor for the Mariposa excavation was both practical necessity and ideological statement, demonstrating the Enclave's view of mainland populations as expendable resources suitable only for tasks too dangerous or degrading for pure human personnel. The slaves were drawn from raider gangs, failed communities, and isolated settlements whose disappearance would not be noticed or investigated by other survivor groups. Their capture and transportation to the excavation site was handled with the same efficiency that the Enclave applied to all their operations, though with considerably less concern for the comfort or survival of the subjects involved. Frank's management of the slave labor force revealed both his exceptional organizational skills and his complete emotional detachment from the suffering of those he considered genetically inferior. He established work schedules that maximized productivity, while accepting casualty rates that would have been unthinkable in operations involving Enclave personnel. He implemented security measures that prevented escape attempts while ensuring that any resistance was met with immediate and brutal suppression. Most importantly, he maintained the psychological distance necessary to view the enslaved workers as tools rather than human beings, a perspective that enabled him to make decisions based purely on operational efficiency rather than moral considerations. The excavation process itself proceeded with methodical precision, despite the extreme hazards involved in penetrating the ruins of a facility that had been designed to contain humanity's most dangerous biological research. Teams of enslaved workers, protected by minimal radiation gear that provided only temporary protection against the lethal environment, descended into collapsed sections of the base to locate and extract containers of scientific materials. Their work was guided by pre-war blueprints and technical specifications that enabled targeted recovery efforts rather than random exploration of the dangerous ruins. The first signs of FEV exposure among the excavation crews appeared within weeks of beginning the deep penetration work, manifesting as the characteristic symptoms that pre-war researchers had documented in their experimental subjects. Workers began experiencing rapid cellular changes that altered their physical appearance, increased their size and strength, and in many cases, reduced their intellectual capacity to levels that made them unsuitable for continued labor. The Enclave's medical personnel monitored these transformations with scientific interest rather than humanitarian concern, documenting the progression of mutation while making no efforts to treat or reverse the process. Frank's own exposure to FEV began as background contamination from his extended presence in the excavation area, a gradual absorption of viral particles through respiratory and dermal contact that accumulated over months of supervisory duties. The initial effects were so subtle as to be unnoticeable: slight increases in appetite and energy levels, minor improvements in physical strength and endurance, changes in sleep patterns that suggested enhanced metabolic efficiency. But beneath these superficial improvements, more fundamental alterations were taking place in his genetic structure and cellular composition. The discovery of intact FEV storage facilities deep within the Mariposa ruins represented the culmination of months of dangerous and expensive excavation work, revealing scientific treasures that exceeded even the most optimistic projections about what might have survived the facility's destruction. Hundreds of sealed containers held samples of various viral strains, research notes that documented pre-war experimental procedures, and most importantly, the complete genetic sequencing data that would enable the Enclave scientists to understand and potentially modify the virus for their own purposes. The transportation of recovered FEV samples to the Enclave's oil rig laboratory facilities required security measures that reflected both the extreme value of the materials and the catastrophic consequences that would result from any accident or sabotage during the transfer process. Frank personally supervised the packaging and shipment of the most sensitive items, ensuring that proper containment protocols were followed while maintaining absolute secrecy about the nature of the cargo being moved. His attention to detail during this phase of the operation demonstrated both his understanding of the material's significance and his commitment to protecting the Enclave's most important strategic assets. But as the excavation work continued, and Frank's exposure to FEV increased, the subtle changes in his physiology began to accelerate and become more noticeable to both himself and others around him. His already impressive physical strength increased to levels that strained the specifications of his equipment and weapons. His height began to increase incrementally but consistently, requiring modifications to his uniforms and living quarters. Most concerning to those who worked closely with him, his emotional responses seemed to be flattening, with normal human reactions to stress, humor, and social interaction becoming increasingly muted and mechanical. The Enclave's medical monitoring of personnel involved in the Mariposa operation was comprehensive and systematic, designed to detect contamination before it progressed to levels that might compromise operational security or personnel safety. Frank's regular examinations revealed cellular changes consistent with FEV exposure, but the progression was gradual enough and the manifestations subtle enough that his continued fitness for duty remained unquestioned by his superiors. The medical staff noted his enhanced physical capabilities as potentially beneficial for his role, while dismissing the psychological changes as normal adaptation to the stresses of extended hazardous duty. The completion of the major excavation work at Mariposa marked not just the successful recovery of invaluable scientific materials, but the beginning of Frank's transformation from enhanced human into something altogether different and more dangerous. The months of exposure had fundamentally altered his genetic structure in ways that would continue to manifest long after his departure from the contaminated ruins. His body had become a laboratory for uncontrolled viral experimentation, with changes occurring at the cellular level that would eventually reshape every aspect of his physical existence. Frank's final weeks at the Mariposa site were marked by increasing awareness that something fundamental was happening to his body. Though he lacked the scientific knowledge necessary to understand the nature or implications of the changes he was experiencing, his strength continued to increase beyond normal human limits, enabling him to perform feats of physical prowess that amazed even his fellow Enclave personnel. His pain tolerance seemed to be increasing as well, with injuries that would have incapacitated normal humans becoming minor inconveniences that barely registered on his consciousness. But perhaps most significantly, Frank's psychological relationship with violence was evolving in ways that would prove crucial for his future role within the Enclave's strategic planning. The emotional detachment that had always characterized his approach to elimination operations was becoming more complete and automatic, with normal human responses to suffering and death being replaced by purely analytical assessment of operational effectiveness. He was becoming not just physically stronger, but emotionally harder, a transformation that would make him ideal for the role he was unknowingly being prepared to fill. The orders that recalled Frank from Mariposa patrol duty came at a moment when his superiors had begun to recognize that something unprecedented was happening to one of their most valuable agents. His regular reports had noted his enhanced physical capabilities and improved operational effectiveness, but they had also revealed psychological changes that suggested either exceptional adaptation to combat stress or the beginning of a more fundamental alteration in his mental processes. The decision to bring him back to the oil rig for comprehensive medical evaluation reflected both concern for his welfare and recognition that his transformation might represent an opportunity rather than a problem. Frank's journey from the ruins of Mariposa to the Enclave's headquarters marked the end of his career as a normal human agent and the beginning of his evolution into something that would transcend the limitations of ordinary mortality. The FEV flowing through his bloodstream had already begun the process of cellular restructuring that would eventually transform him into the perfect weapon for the Enclave's war against genetic contamination. But this transformation would require not just viral mutation, but deliberate scientific intervention, surgical enhancement, and technological augmentation that would blur the line between human evolution and mechanical engineering. The man who boarded the transport aircraft for his return to the oil rig was still recognizably Frank Horrigan, loyal servant of the Enclave and dedicated protector of human purity. But the changes already taking place within his body were irreversible and accelerating, carrying him toward a destiny that would make him both the ultimate expression of everything the Enclave valued and the perfect symbol of everything they claimed to oppose. The virus that had been designed to create super soldiers was about to fulfill its original purpose in ways that its creators had never imagined and could never have anticipated. Frank's arrival at the oil rig medical facilities would mark the beginning of the most intensive and invasive scientific experimentation ever conducted on a living human subject, a process that would transform him from enhanced soldier into living weapon while preserving the loyalty and dedication that made him valuable to the organization that had shaped his entire existence. The Enclave scientists were about to discover whether their theories about controlled evolution could be applied to create the perfect fusion of human intelligence, superhuman capability, and absolute devotion to their cause. The next phase of Frank's existence would test not just his physical resilience, but his psychological stability, as the organization that had trained him to preserve human purity prepared to transform him into something that challenged every assumption about what it meant to be human. But Frank's loyalty to the Enclave remained unshakable, even as his body prepared to betray everything he had been taught to value, creating the perfect paradox that would define his role as both protector and destroyer of the world he sought to preserve. The medical bay aboard the Enclave oil rig had witnessed many scientific achievements during its decades of operation, but nothing in its sterile history could compare to the project that began when Frank Horrigan was wheeled into the surgical suite on a reinforced gurney that groaned under his already substantial weight. The man who had departed for Mariposa patrol duty as an exceptional but fundamentally human agent had returned as something that challenged every assumption about the boundaries between natural evolution and artificial enhancement. His transformation would require not just medical intervention, but a complete reimagining of what the human form could become when guided by scientific ambition, unconstrained by moral limitations. Dr. Anderson, the Enclave's chief medical researcher, approached Frank's case with the methodical precision that had made him invaluable to the organization's biological weapons program. His initial examination revealed cellular changes consistent with FEV exposure, but the progression was unlike anything documented in previous research on viral mutation, where most subjects experienced rapid and often fatal alterations that destroyed their cognitive abilities. Frank's transformation seemed to be proceeding along controlled pathways that enhanced, rather than degraded, his functional capabilities. The decision to proceed with experimental enhancement rather than attempting to reverse Frank's mutation reflected the Enclave leadership's recognition that his condition represented an unprecedented opportunity to create exactly the kind of weapon their long-term strategic planning required. President Richardson himself authorized the allocation of unlimited resources to the project, understanding that success could provide them with capabilities that would revolutionize their approach to mainland conquest and population control. Frank's conscious participation in the early phases of his transformation was limited but significant, his absolute loyalty to the Enclave enabling him to submit to procedures that would have broken the will of lesser men. He understood that his service to the organization might require sacrifices that ordinary agents could never be expected to make, and his willingness to become a test subject for experimental enhancement demonstrated the depth of his commitment to their cause. The pain was irrelevant, the risks were acceptable, and the potential benefits to the Enclave's mission were incalculable. The surgical procedures that began Frank's transformation into something beyond normal human limitations were conducted with the same attention to detail that characterized all Enclave scientific endeavors, but with the added urgency that came from working with a subject whose cellular structure was continuing to change even as the operations proceeded. Dr. Anderson's team worked in carefully coordinated shifts, maintaining constant monitoring of Frank's vital signs, while implementing modifications that would enhance his natural mutation rather than fighting against its progression. The first phase of Frank's enhancement focused on stabilizing and directing the viral changes already occurring in his muscular and skeletal systems. The FEV had begun increasing his bone density and muscle mass far beyond normal human parameters, but without surgical intervention, the growth would eventually become uncontrolled and potentially fatal. The medical team's solution involved the insertion of cybernetic regulators that would monitor and direct the mutation process, ensuring that Frank's physical development proceeded along optimal pathways while preventing the kind of runaway growth that had destroyed other subjects. Frank's cardiovascular system required extensive modification to support the metabolic demands of his enhanced physiology, with his heart being supplemented by artificial circulation systems that could maintain blood flow throughout his rapidly expanding body mass. The surgical installation of these systems was complicated by his body's continued growth during the procedure, requiring constant adjustments to ensure that the mechanical components would remain functional as his transformation progressed. But perhaps the most crucial aspect of Frank's enhancement involved the preservation and augmentation of his cognitive abilities, preventing the intelligence loss that had affected most previous FEV subjects while potentially improving his analytical and tactical capabilities. The medical team's approach combined direct neural intervention with pharmaceutical enhancement, using a combination of surgical implants and chemical treatments to maintain the integrity of his brain function while the rest of his body underwent radical transformation. The power armor that would become permanently integrated with Frank's enhanced physiology represented the pinnacle of pre-war military technology, modified with post-war innovations that pushed the boundaries of engineering possibility. The armor was not simply worn, but grafted directly onto his skeletal structure, creating a fusion of organic and mechanical systems that would be impossible to remove without killing the subject. The integration process required months of careful surgical work, with each component being installed and tested before proceeding to the next phase of the enhancement. Frank's helmet, which would eventually become his most recognizable feature, was designed not just for protection but as a life support system that would regulate his breathing, monitor his vital signs, and deliver the constant pharmaceutical maintenance that his enhanced metabolism would require. The surgical attachment of the helmet to his skull was irreversible, marking the point at which Frank ceased to be a man wearing armor and became something entirely new and unprecedented. The psychological impact of Frank's transformation was monitored as carefully as the physical changes, with the medical team conducting regular assessments to ensure that his personality and loyalty remained intact despite the radical alterations to his brain chemistry and neural structure. The results were remarkable and somewhat unexpected, showing not just the preservation of his original characteristics but their intensification and refinement. His loyalty to the Enclave became even more absolute, his emotional detachment more complete, and his capacity for violence more focused and efficient. The 2-year period of Frank's transformation was marked by episodes of consciousness that provided glimpses of the man he was becoming, moments when the sedation was reduced to allow for testing and evaluation of his developing capabilities. These sessions invariably resulted in violent incidents, as Frank's enhanced strength and reduced inhibitions combined to create outbursts that threatened the safety of the medical personnel working on his case. The solution was heavier sedation and more comprehensive restraint systems, but the incidents provided valuable data about his emerging psychological profile. Frank's first fully conscious awakening after the completion of his transformation revealed the success of the Enclave's most ambitious scientific project and the birth of something that transcended the boundaries between human evolution and technological achievement. Standing nearly 12 feet tall and weighing approximately 4,000 pounds in his integrated armor, he represented the perfect fusion of biological enhancement and mechanical augmentation. His voice, filtered through his helmet's communication systems, carried the same absolute loyalty and emotional control that had characterized his pre-transformation personality, but amplified to match his physical capabilities. The initial field tests that evaluated Frank's combat effectiveness were conducted against targets that posed no real threat to Enclave interests, but provided opportunities to assess his capabilities under controlled conditions. Abandoned settlements, isolated raider camps, and small groups of super mutants served as proving grounds for weapons systems that had never before been tested on living subjects. The results exceeded even the most optimistic projections about what the enhancement process might achieve. Frank's strength was sufficient to crush power armor with his bare hands, to throw grown men distances that defied normal understanding of human capability, and to wield weapons that had been designed for vehicle mounting as personal armament. His speed, despite his massive size, enabled him to close distances with enemies before they could react effectively to his presence. Most importantly, his intelligence remained not just intact but enhanced, allowing him to apply tactical thinking and strategic planning to combat situations with effectiveness that surpassed even experienced military commanders. The psychological evaluation of Frank's post-transformation personality revealed characteristics that made him ideal for the role the Enclave intended him to fill. His emotional responses had been refined to focus exclusively on mission-relevant considerations, with normal human reactions to violence, suffering, and death being replaced by purely analytical assessment of operational effectiveness. He felt no remorse for necessary actions, no hesitation about collateral damage, and no concern about the human cost of achieving Enclave objectives. But perhaps most remarkably, Frank's enhancement had not altered his fundamental self-perception or his relationship with the organization that had created him. He did not see himself as a mutant or monster, but as the ultimate expression of human potential, guided by proper scientific and ideological direction. His loyalty to the Enclave remained absolute because he understood that they had not corrupted or degraded him, but had enabled him to become everything he was capable of being. The transformation was not a betrayal of human purity, but its fulfillment through the application of superior knowledge and technology. Frank's integration into active operations began with assignments that tested his capabilities, while maintaining the secrecy that was essential to the Enclave's strategic planning. Intelligence-gathering missions that had previously required entire teams could now be accomplished by Frank alone, his enhanced senses and analytical abilities enabling him to collect information with efficiency that surpassed conventional methods. Elimination operations that had posed significant risks to normal agents became routine tasks that Frank could complete without meaningful danger to himself or compromise to operational security. The fear that Frank inspired in both enemies and neutral parties became one of his most valuable assets, creating psychological effects that often eliminated the need for actual violence. His mere appearance was sufficient to break the resistance of most opposition, while his reputation spread through wasteland communities like a plague, creating an atmosphere of terror that served Enclave interests by discouraging organized resistance to their activities. Frank's role as the public face of Enclave power was carefully managed to maximize the intimidation factor while maintaining operational security about the organization's true capabilities and intentions. He was deployed in situations where his presence would send clear messages about the consequences of opposing Enclave interests, but always with careful attention to preventing the revelation of sensitive information about their long-term planning and resource allocation. The tactical applications of Frank's enhanced capabilities were limited only by the imagination of his handlers and the strategic requirements of specific operations. He could serve as a one-man army in conventional combat situations, as an unstoppable interrogator when information was needed from uncooperative subjects, or as an instrument of terror when psychological warfare was more valuable than direct military action. His versatility made him invaluable for the complex and varied challenges that the Enclave faced in their preparation for mainland conquest. But Frank's greatest value to the Enclave lay not in his individual capabilities, but in what he represented as a proof of concept for their approach to human enhancement and social engineering. His successful transformation demonstrated that genetic purity could be preserved and enhanced rather than compromised by scientific intervention, that loyalty and intelligence could be maintained, while physical capabilities were pushed beyond normal limitations, and that the right combination of biological and technological enhancement could create beings superior to both normal humans and random mutants. The implications of Frank's existence for the Enclave's long-term strategic planning were profound and far-reaching, suggesting possibilities for human enhancement that could revolutionize their approach to post-war reconstruction and population management. If the process that had created Frank could be refined and standardized, they might be able to create entire military units with similar capabilities, transforming their small population into a force capable of overwhelming any conceivable opposition. Frank's daily routine as the Enclave's ultimate weapon involved constant training and preparation for operations that would test his capabilities while advancing the organization's strategic objectives. Physical conditioning that would have killed normal humans served merely as warm-up exercises for his enhanced physiology. Weapons training with experimental systems that pushed the boundaries of portable firepower. Tactical planning sessions that explored the possibilities opened by having an asset with his unique combination of capabilities and limitations. The relationship between Frank and his handlers was complex and carefully managed, balancing the need to maintain his loyalty and effectiveness with the recognition that his enhanced capabilities made him potentially dangerous to those around him. His absolute dedication to the Enclave's cause provided some assurance that he would not turn against his creators, but his physical power was such that even accidental violence could have catastrophic consequences for personnel who lacked his enhanced durability. Frank's integration with standard Enclave military units required extensive modifications to normal operational procedures and tactical doctrines, accommodating capabilities that exceeded the parameters of conventional military planning. Units that operated with Frank learned to function as support elements for his individual actions rather than as independent combat forces, providing reconnaissance, logistics, and extraction services, while he served as the primary instrument of mission accomplishment. The psychological impact of Frank's transformation on other Enclave personnel was carefully monitored and managed, ensuring that his presence would inspire confidence in the organization's capabilities rather than fear about the direction of their scientific research. Most personnel understood Frank as the ultimate expression of Enclave technological superiority, a demonstration that their organization could achieve things that other post-war factions could never match or counter effectively. As Frank's reputation within the organization grew, so did the scope and importance of the missions entrusted to his capabilities. What had begun as field tests and proof-of-concept operations evolved into critical assignments that could significantly impact the success of the Enclave's long-term strategic planning. His effectiveness in these operations validated the enormous investment of resources and scientific expertise that had gone into his creation, while demonstrating the potential for future enhancement projects. The success of Frank's transformation marked not just a scientific achievement, but a philosophical victory for the Enclave's approach to human development and social engineering. They had proven that genetic purity could be preserved and enhanced through scientific intervention, that loyalty and intelligence could survive radical physical modification, and that the right combination of biological and technological enhancement could create beings superior to anything that random mutation had produced in the wasteland. Frank Horrigan had become more than a man, more than a weapon, more than even the sum of the science and ideology that had created him. He was the living embodiment of the Enclave's vision for humanity's future, the perfect fusion of everything they valued most: genetic superiority, technological advancement, and absolute dedication to proper authority. His existence proved that their cause was not just righteous, but inevitable, that they possessed the knowledge and capability to reshape the post-war world according to their specifications. The stage was now set for Frank to take his place as the Enclave's ultimate enforcer, the instrument through which their will would be imposed upon a wasteland that had grown complacent in its contamination and chaos. His transformation was complete, his capabilities had been tested and proven, and his loyalty remained absolute. The time had come for the world to learn what the Enclave's vision of human perfection could accomplish when unleashed upon those who stood in the way of proper civilization's restoration. The laboratories beneath the Enclave oil rig hummed with the quiet efficiency of scientific progress as Dr. Charles Curling bent over his latest batch of viral samples, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was attempting to create. The forced evolutionary virus that had been recovered from Mariposa represented humanity's most dangerous biological achievement, but Curling's modifications would transform it from a tool of mutation into an instrument of extinction. His work would not enhance human capabilities but eliminate human contamination, creating a weapon that could cleanse the world of genetic impurity. With the precision of a surgeon's scalpel applied to the entire North American continent. The project that would become known as Curling 13 began with theoretical research into the viral mechanisms that controlled FEV's effects on human cellular structure, exploring the possibility of reversing or redirecting the mutation process to serve the Enclave's strategic objectives. Curling's initial experiments focused on understanding why some subjects experienced beneficial mutations while others suffered rapid death or severe cognitive impairment. The answer, he discovered, lay in genetic markers that determined how individual immune systems responded to viral invasion and cellular transformation. Frank Horrigan's role in the Curling 13 project began even before his own transformation was complete, as blood and tissue samples from his ongoing enhancement provided crucial data about how FEV interacted with genetically pure human subjects. His unique response to viral exposure, which had enhanced rather than degraded his capabilities, offered insights into the mechanisms that could potentially be exploited to create targeted biological weapons. The irony that Frank's own mutation would contribute to developing a virus designed to eliminate mutants was lost on him, his absolute loyalty to the Enclave, preventing any consideration of the philosophical contradictions inherent in his situation. The scientific breakthrough that enabled Curling's success came from his recognition that FEV's effects could be inverted through careful genetic programming, transforming a virus that accelerated human evolution into one that would prove fatal to anyone carrying the genetic markers associated with radiation exposure and environmental adaptation. The modified virus would identify contaminated genetic sequences and trigger cascading cellular failures that would result in rapid death, while leaving genetically pure subjects unharmed by its effects. President Richardson's enthusiasm for the Curling 13 project reflected his understanding that conventional military action, even with assets like Frank Horrigan, would be insufficient to eliminate the millions of contaminated humans who infested the territories that the Enclave intended to reclaim. Biological warfare offered the possibility of achieving their objectives with minimal risk to Enclave personnel and resources, clearing vast areas of opposition without the need for extensive ground operations or prolonged occupation campaigns. The development of Curling 13 required test subjects whose genetic profiles represented the full spectrum of post-war human adaptation, from barely noticeable radiation exposure to the extreme mutations that characterized ghouls and supermutants. Acquiring these subjects became one of Frank's primary responsibilities, utilizing his enhanced capabilities to capture specimens from across the wasteland without alerting other survivor communities to the Enclave's activities or intentions. Frank's first major operation in support of the Curling 13 project involved the systematic abduction of residents from Arroyo, the tribal community that had been established by descendants of Vault 13. The settlement's isolation and limited defensive capabilities made it an ideal target for specimen collection, while its population's relatively pure genetic heritage provided valuable control subjects for testing the virus's selectivity mechanisms. Frank's approach to the operation demonstrated his evolution from enhanced soldier into something approaching a natural disaster, a force that could devastate entire communities without meaningful resistance. The assault on Arroyo was conducted with the mechanical efficiency that characterized all of Frank's operations, but with a brutality that reflected his complete emotional detachment from the suffering of those he considered genetically inferior. He moved through the settlement like a plague given physical form, selecting specimens according to predetermined criteria while eliminating anyone who might pose a threat or serve no useful purpose for the research project. The survivors were loaded into transport containers like livestock, their terror and confusion irrelevant to the greater purpose they would serve. The transportation of captured test subjects to the oil rig's experimental facilities required careful management to ensure their survival during the journey, while preventing any possibility of escape or communication with potential risque forces. Frank personally supervised these transfers, his presence alone sufficient to prevent any thoughts of resistance among the captives, while his enhanced senses detected any attempts at concealment or deception that might compromise operational security. The experimental procedures that followed the subject's arrival at the Enclave laboratories represented medical science, unconstrained by ethical considerations, with Dr. Curling's team conducting tests that pushed the boundaries of human endurance, while gathering data about viral effectiveness and genetic selectivity. The subjects were exposed to various strains of modified FEV under controlled conditions, with their responses monitored and documented to refine the virus's targeting mechanisms and optimize its lethality rates. Frank's observation of these experiments provided him with detailed knowledge of the weapon he was helping to create, though his psychological conditioning prevented any moral qualms about the suffering involved in its development. He understood that the elimination of genetic contamination was essential for the restoration of proper human civilization, and that the temporary discomfort of inferior specimens was insignificant compared to the ultimate benefits that the Enclave's victory would provide for humanity's future. The results of the initial testing exceeded even Dr. Curling's optimistic projections about the virus's effectiveness and selectivity. Subjects with even minor genetic markers associated with radiation exposure experienced rapid cellular breakdown and death, while control subjects with pure genetic profiles showed no adverse effects from viral exposure. The weapon was proving capable of distinguishing between pure and contaminated humans with accuracy that approached 100%, offering the possibility of surgical strike capabilities that could eliminate specific populations while leaving others untouched. The refinement of Curling 13 continued through multiple iterations as Dr. Curling's team incorporated data from each round of testing to improve the virus's effectiveness and reduce the possibility of unintended consequences. Frank's role in acquiring additional test subjects expanded to include more challenging targets as the research progressed, with operations that tested his capabilities while providing the diverse genetic samples that comprehensive weapon development required. The raid on Vault 13 itself represented the culmination of Frank's specimen collection activities, combining his tactical expertise with his enhanced physical capabilities to penetrate one of the most secure facilities in the post-war world. The Vault's population represented an ideal test group for the final phases of Curling 13 development, their genetic profiles having been preserved through decades of isolation from the contaminated surface environment, while still showing the subtle variations that would enable testing of the virus's discrimination mechanisms. Frank's infiltration of Vault 13 demonstrated the tactical advantages that his enhancement provided for operations that would have been impossible for normal Enclave personnel. His strength enabled him to breach security barriers that had been designed to withstand conventional assault, while his integrated armor systems provided protection against the Vault's automated defense mechanisms. Most importantly, His psychological conditioning enabled him to perform the necessary elimination and capture operations without being affected by the pleas or resistance of the vault dwellers, who had never experienced violence on the scale that Frank represented. The capture of the vault's population, including the intelligent death claws that had made their home in the facility's lower levels, provided Dr. Curling with the final genetic samples necessary to complete Curling 13's development. The death claws in particular represented a unique challenge for the virus's targeting mechanisms, their enhanced intelligence making them potentially valuable, while their obvious mutations marked them for elimination under the Enclave's genetic purity standards. Frank's execution of the death claw elimination order revealed both his tactical efficiency and his complete absence of moral consideration for the intelligence and peaceful nature of his targets. The creature's attempts at communication and negotiation were irrelevant to his operational parameters, while their superior strength and combat capabilities provided only minor challenges for his enhanced systems. The massacre was completed with the same methodical precision that characterized all his assignments, leaving only the specimens required for research purposes alive for transportation to the laboratory facilities. The completion of Curling 13's development marked not just a scientific achievement, but the culmination of everything the Enclave had worked toward since their survival of the Great War. The weapon represented their ultimate answer to the problem of genetic contamination, a tool that could cleanse entire continents of inferior specimens while preserving the pure human heritage that they had protected through decades of careful isolation. Dr. Curling's success had provided them with the means to implement their vision of post-war reconstruction on a scale that conventional military action could never have achieved. Frank's role in the weapon's development had been essential, his unique combination of loyalty, capability, and emotional detachment enabling operations that would have been impossible for normal personnel. His transformation from human agent into enhanced weapon had paralleled the development of Curling 13 itself, creating perfect synergy between the Enclave's biological and technological approaches to achieving their strategic objectives. He had become not just a tool for implementing their policies, but a symbol of what genetic purity could achieve when guided by superior science and unwavering dedication to proper principles. The testing phases that validated Curling 13's effectiveness demonstrated its potential to revolutionize warfare and population control, offering capabilities that exceeded even the most ambitious projections about what biological weapons could accomplish. The virus could be deployed through atmospheric release, water contamination, or direct exposure, with effects that would spread through contaminated populations while leaving pure humans unaffected. The selective nature of its targeting mechanisms meant that the Enclave could eliminate entire regions of opposition without risking their own personnel or compromising the infrastructure they intended to occupy. Frank's participation in the final testing operations provided practical validation of the coordination between enhanced personnel and biological weapon systems, demonstrating how his capabilities could be used to ensure successful weapon deployment, while providing security against any organized resistance that might emerge during the cleansing operations. His presence would guarantee that no contaminated specimens could escape the affected areas to warn other communities or develop countermeasures against the viral weapon. The strategic implications of Curling 13's successful development extended far beyond immediate tactical applications, offering the Enclave possibilities for global population management that could reshape the entire post-war world according to their specifications. The weapon could be modified to target specific genetic markers associated with particular populations or regions, enabling surgical elimination of threats while preserving valuable resources and infrastructure for Enclave use. Frank's understanding of the weapon's capabilities and his role in its implementation was complete but uncomplicated by moral considerations that might have affected lesser agents. He knew that Curling 13 represented humanity's best hope for recovery from the genetic contamination that threatened to permanently degrade the species, and that his participation in its development and deployment was essential service to the greater good. The elimination of millions of contaminated specimens was not genocide, but sanitation, clearing the way for proper human civilization to reclaim its rightful place in the world. The production facilities that would enable large-scale manufacturing of Curling 13 represented another triumph of Enclave scientific and industrial capabilities, demonstrating their ability to translate laboratory successes into operational weapons systems capable of global deployment. Frank's security responsibilities for these facilities reflected the critical importance of protecting the weapon from any possibility of sabotage or theft by contaminated forces who might seek to develop countermeasures or turn the Plown's virus against its creators. The deployment strategy that would guide Curling 13's initial use focused on maximizing psychological impact while demonstrating the weapon's effectiveness to any surviving pure human communities that might consider resistance to Enclave authority. Frank's role in these operations would combine his tactical expertise with his symbolic value as the ultimate expression of genetic purity enhanced through proper scientific guidance, creating terror among contaminated populations while inspiring confidence among those worthy of preservation. The countdown to Curling 13's first operational deployment marked the approaching culmination of everything the Enclave had worked towards since their founding, the moment when their vision of genetic purity and proper authority would begin its transformation from aspiration into reality. Frank stood ready to serve as both weapon and symbol in the campaign that would cleanse the world of contamination while establishing the foundation for humanity's true recovery from the disasters that had nearly destroyed civilization itself. The virus was complete, the delivery systems were prepared, and the target populations had been identified and mapped with precision that would ensure maximum effectiveness with minimal waste of resources. All that remained was the final authorization from President Richardson and the beginning of operations that would reshape the North American continent, according to principles that recognize genetic purity as the foundation of all human achievement and moral authority. Frank Horrigan stood at the center of these preparations, no longer merely a man enhanced by science, but the living embodiment of everything the Enclave valued and everything their enemies should fear. His transformation was complete, his loyalty was absolute, and his capabilities were perfectly suited for the role he would play in the approaching cleansing of the wasteland. The weapon was ready, the soldier was prepared, and the time for implementation was at hand. The wasteland stretched endlessly beneath a sky that had forgotten the meaning of mercy, its broken horizons offering no comfort to those who wandered its irradiated expanse in search of hope that might no longer exist. Across this devastated landscape, whispers began to spread like wildfire through the scattered communities of survivors. Stories of a shadow that moved with purpose and destruction, a figure whose very presence meant death for those who had dared to oppose forces they did not understand. The Chosen One had emerged from the tribal settlement of Arroyo with a mission that seemed simple enough, but their quest would set in motion a collision course with the most dangerous predator the post-war world had ever produced. Frank Horrigan's emergence as the Enclave's primary field operative marked a new phase in their preparation for continental conquest, transforming him from experimental subject into active hunter whose prey included anyone who might threaten their carefully laid plans. His assignments during this period were designed not just to eliminate immediate threats, but to establish patterns of fear that would paralyze potential opposition, while demonstrating the futility of resistance against Enclave power. Each mission was calibrated to maximize psychological impact while maintaining operational security, creating a reputation that would serve their interests long after the specific operations were completed. The encounter near Klamath that would become the stuff of wasteland legend began with intelligence reports about an elderly prospector who had been asking too many questions about strange aircraft sightings and unusual military activity in areas where no official forces should have been operating. The man's curiosity might have been dismissed as the harmless obsession of an isolated wanderer, but his background as a former military communications specialist made him potentially dangerous to Enclave operations that depended on absolute secrecy for their success. Frank's approach to eliminating this minor threat demonstrated the overwhelming disproportion between his capabilities and the resistance that most wasteland targets could offer, but also revealed his complete indifference to the suffering of those he considered inferior specimens deserving of elimination. The confrontation was brief and one-sided, with the elderly man's attempts at explanation or negotiation being irrelevant to Frank's operational parameters. The execution was carried out with mechanical efficiency, but with enough visible brutality to ensure that anyone who discovered the scene would understand the futility of opposing the forces that had claimed this victim. The psychological impact of this seemingly minor operation exceeded its tactical significance, as word of the mysterious armored giant spread through trading networks and survivor communities with the speed that only genuine terror could achieve. Descriptions of Frank's appearance, capabilities, and absolute ruthlessness began to take on mythological qualities as they passed from settlement to settlement, creating a climate of fear that served Enclave interests by discouraging investigation into their activities while establishing Frank's reputation as an unstoppable force. But Frank's role as the Enclave's instrument of terror extended far beyond the elimination of individual threats to encompass systematic campaigns against entire communities that had been marked for destruction or specimen collection. The intelligent death claws that had made their home in Vault 13 represented a particularly complex challenge. Their enhanced cognitive abilities, making them potentially valuable, while their obvious mutations marked them as targets for elimination under the Enclave's genetic purity standards. The massacre of the intelligent death claws revealed Frank's tactical evolution from enhanced soldier into something approaching a natural disaster, a force that could devastate organized resistance without meaningful risk to himself or compromise to operational objectives. The creature's attempts at communication and negotiation were irrelevant to his mission parameters, while their superior physical capabilities provided only minor challenges for his integrated weapon systems and enhanced durability. The operation was completed with the same methodical precision that characterized all his assignments, leaving no survivors to warn other communities about the approaching storm. The Brotherhood of Steel had survived the post-war period through a combination of technological superiority, military discipline, and careful isolation from the contaminated masses that surrounded their hidden facilities. But their policy of monitoring and occasionally intervening in wasteland affairs had brought them to the attention of Enclave intelligence analysts who recognized them as potential obstacles to future operations and sources of advanced technology that could strengthen opposition forces, if not eliminated preemptively. Matthew, the Brotherhood Paladin, whose reconnaissance operations had begun to penetrate Enclave security measures, represented exactly the kind of threat that Frank had been designed to eliminate. His power armor provided protection against conventional weapons. His training enabled him to function effectively in hostile territory, and his intelligence-gathering capabilities posed genuine risks to operational security if his activities were allowed to continue. But Matthew's enhanced capabilities and military experience would prove insufficient against an opponent who transcended normal human limitations in every meaningful category. The confrontation between Frank and Matthew became a demonstration of the technological and biological advantages that the Enclave's enhancement programs had achieved, pitting the Brotherhood's best military technology against capabilities that redefined the boundaries of human potential. Matthew's power armor, which had protected him through years of dangerous operations, was crushed like paper under Frank's enhanced strength. His weapons, which had been sufficient to eliminate super mutants and other wasteland threats, barely scratched Frank's integrated armor systems. Most tellingly, his tactical training and combat experience were irrelevant against an opponent whose speed, strength, and durability exceeded every assumption about what human enhancement could achieve. Frank's elimination of Matthew was accomplished with the same emotional detachment that characterized all his operations, but with particular efficiency that demonstrated his tactical superiority over even the most elite opposition forces. The Brotherhood Paladin's death served multiple strategic objectives, eliminating a specific intelligence threat while sending a clear message to other potential opponents about the futility of opposing Enclave operations. The body was left in a condition that would make the cause of death obvious to anyone who discovered it, ensuring maximum psychological impact on Brotherhood leadership and wasteland communities generally. The reputation that Frank was building through these operations served the Enclave's interests in ways that extended far beyond immediate tactical advantages, creating an atmosphere of terror that would paralyze potential opposition while demonstrating the overwhelming superiority of their scientific and military capabilities. Stories of the armored giant who appeared without warning to eliminate threats to unknown masters became part of wasteland folklore, inspiring fear among those who might consider resistance while encouraging cooperation among populations that recognized their vulnerability to forces beyond their understanding or ability to counter. Frank's systematic elimination of Enclave enemies during this period followed patterns that reflected both his enhanced capabilities and the strategic priorities that guided his deployment. High-value targets whose knowledge or capabilities posed genuine threats to operational security received personal attention that ensured their permanent elimination. Communities or organizations that showed signs of coordinated resistance were subjected to demonstration attacks that displayed the futility of opposition while encouraging submission to Enclave authority. Most importantly, potential sources of intelligence about Enclave activities were eliminated before their information could compromise sensitive operations or alert other threats to the approaching danger. The Chosen One's emergence as a significant threat to Enclave operations was initially dismissed by intelligence analysts who had grown accustomed to the primitive capabilities of most wasteland inhabitants. But as reports accumulated about their growing influence and effectiveness in opposing established power structures, Frank was assigned to monitor their activities and eliminate them if their interference with Enclave objectives became unacceptable. The assignment represented a shift from routine threat elimination to potential confrontation with an opponent whose capabilities remained unknown, but whose impact on wasteland politics was becoming increasingly significant. Frank's initial surveillance of the Chosen One revealed an adversary whose capabilities exceeded those of typical wasteland inhabitants while remaining far below the level that would pose genuine challenges to his enhanced systems. Their combat skills were adequate for dealing with raiders and super mutants, but insufficient for confronting opponents with Enclave training and equipment. Their intelligence gathering and diplomatic abilities had enabled them to build networks of allies and information sources, but these advantages would be irrelevant in direct confrontation with superior firepower and tactical capabilities. The decision to allow the Chosen One to continue their activities rather than eliminating them immediately reflected the Enclave's confidence in their ability to manage any threat that wasteland inhabitants could pose while recognizing the potential intelligence value of observing their methods and contacts. Frank's continued surveillance provided detailed information about resistance networks, allied communities, and potential sources of opposition that might require attention during future operations. The Chosen One's activities served Enclave interests by revealing threats that might otherwise have remained hidden until they could cause significant damage. But as the Chosen One's influence continued to expand, and their interference with Enclave operations became more direct, Frank's role evolved from passive observation to active threat management. His elimination of contacts who provided the Chosen One with information or assistance served multiple objectives, degrading their operational capabilities while demonstrating the consequences of opposing Enclave interests. Each death sent clear messages to potential allies about the risks of association with enemies of proper authority, while providing Frank with opportunities to test his capabilities against increasingly sophisticated opposition. The pattern of elimination that Frank established during his hunting operations revealed both his tactical efficiency and his complete absence of moral consideration for the suffering his actions caused among wasteland communities. Family members, friends, and associates of his primary targets were eliminated not because they posed direct threats, but because their deaths would maximize psychological impact on surviving populations while ensuring that no witnesses could provide detailed information about his capabilities or methods to potential enemies. Frank's reputation as an unstoppable force grew with each successful operation, creating a mythology that served Enclave interests by discouraging resistance while establishing him as the visible symbol of their power and ruthlessness. Wasteland inhabitants learned to fear the sound of his approaching footsteps, the distinctive silhouette of his armored form, and most of all, the absolute certainty that his appearance meant death for anyone who had been marked as an enemy of his masters. The psychological warfare aspects of his deployment proved as valuable as his direct elimination capabilities, creating terror that paralyzed opposition forces while encouraging submission among populations that recognized their helplessness against such overwhelming power. The elimination of potential allies and information sources that might have assisted the Chosen One's mission demonstrated Frank's evolution from enhanced soldier into strategic asset, whose operations served multiple objectives simultaneously. Each death weakened the growing resistance network while providing intelligence about its structure and capabilities. The terror his actions inspired discouraged new recruitment while encouraging existing members to abandon their activities rather than risk similar fates. Most importantly, the systematic nature of his campaign demonstrated the Enclave's comprehensive knowledge of opposition activities and their ability to eliminate threats at any level of organization or capability. Frank's operations during this period were characterized by perfect mission success rates that reflected both his enhanced capabilities and the superior intelligence that guided his deployment. No target assigned to him survived to continue their activities. No operation failed to achieve its stated objectives, and no mission resulted in compromise to Enclave security or revelation of sensitive information. His effectiveness validated the enormous investment of resources and scientific expertise that had gone into his creation, while demonstrating the potential for future enhancement projects to provide similar capabilities. The communities that fell under Frank's attention during his hunting operations experienced the full weight of Enclave power, directed through an agent who combined overwhelming physical capabilities with absolute emotional detachment from the suffering his actions caused. Settlements that had harbored enemies of Enclave interests were subjected to demonstration attacks that eliminated specific threats while leaving survivors to spread word of the consequences of opposing proper authority. The precision of these operations served multiple strategic objectives while minimizing resource expenditure and operational exposure. The intelligence networks that had begun to coalesce around the Chosen One's activities were systematically dismantled through Frank's targeted elimination of key figures, whose knowledge or capabilities made them valuable to resistance efforts. Information brokers, technical specialists, military leaders, and diplomatic contacts were eliminated with surgical precision that disrupted coordination, while preventing the development of effective countermeasures against Enclave operations. Each death weakened the opposition's capabilities while providing valuable intelligence about their methods and objectives. Frank's role as the Enclave's primary instrument of terror reached its full development during this period of systematic threat elimination, establishing him as both tactical asset and psychological weapon whose mere existence served their strategic interests. The fear he inspired among wasteland populations was becoming as valuable as his direct operational capabilities, creating an atmosphere of helplessness and submission that would facilitate future conquest operations while minimizing resistance to Enclave authority. The hunting operations that defined Frank's career as the Enclave's premier field operative demonstrated the perfect fusion of enhanced human capabilities with advanced technology and absolute ideological commitment. His success validated every aspect of the scientific and political philosophy that had guided his creation, while proving that genetic purity enhanced through proper scientific guidance could achieve capabilities that surpassed anything random mutation had produced in the wasteland. The weapon had been tested, the soldier had been proven, and the stage was set for the final confrontation that would determine the future of post-war America. The oil rig had stood as a monument to Enclave ingenuity and determination for over 160 years, its gleaming superstructure rising from the Pacific waters like a mechanical mountain that defied the chaos and decay that had consumed the mainland. From its heavily fortified decks, the last remnants of legitimate American government had watched the world burn and slowly heal, biding their time while perfecting the tools that would enable them to reclaim their birthright. But on this day, the fortress that had seemed impregnable to every external threat was about to face an invasion that would test not just its physical defenses, but the very foundations of everything the Enclave had worked to achieve. The Chosen One's infiltration of the oil rig represented the culmination of months of investigation, preparation, and desperate courage that had brought them from the tribal settlements of Northern California to the heart of the most dangerous conspiracy in the post-war world. Their journey had revealed the scope of the Enclave's ambitions, the horrifying nature of their methods, and most importantly, the imminent threat that their Curling 13 project posed to every living being on the North American continent. The weight of this knowledge pressed down upon them like the ocean depths that surrounded their target, but it also provided the moral clarity necessary for actions that would have seemed impossible under normal circumstances. The approach to the oil rig had required every skill the Chosen One had developed during their odyssey through the wasteland, combining stealth, deception, and carefully timed violence to penetrate defensive systems that had been designed to repel conventional military assault. The platform's isolation had always been its greatest strength, but that same remoteness now worked against its defenders by preventing rapid reinforcement or evacuation when their security was finally compromised. The Chosen One moved through corridors that had never before been walked by unauthorized personnel, carrying with them the hopes of millions who would never know their names or understand the magnitude of their sacrifice. President Richardson's reaction to news of the intrusion reflected both his absolute confidence in the Enclave's security systems and his fundamental inability to comprehend that contaminated specimens might possess the intelligence and determination necessary to threaten his carefully laid plans. For decades, mainland survivors had been dismissed as primitive scavengers whose technological capabilities barely exceeded those of pre-war children, making the possibility of a successful infiltration seem as unlikely as spontaneous nuclear disarmament. But the Chosen One's presence in his private chambers forced Richardson to confront the reality that his enemies might be more resourceful and dangerous than his ideology had allowed him to believe. The confrontation between the Chosen One and President Richardson became a debate about the fundamental nature of humanity, civilization, and the moral authority that justified radical action in service of ideological principles. Richardson's arguments reflected decades of isolation among like-minded individuals who had reinforced each other's beliefs without external challenge or contradiction. His worldview was internally consistent and philosophically sophisticated, but it was also completely divorced from the reality of how post-war communities had actually developed and adapted to their harsh circumstances. Richardson's death marked not just the elimination of a political leader, but the symbolic end of an entire worldview that had shaped Enclave policy since their founding. His assassination removed the driving force behind their most ambitious projects while creating a leadership vacuum that would prevent coordinated response to the crisis that was rapidly developing throughout the oil rig. But more immediately, his death activated security protocols that would transform the platform from sanctuary into death trap, with automated systems designed to prevent the compromise of sensitive information, even at the cost of destroying the facility and everyone aboard. Dr. Curling's confrontation with the Chosen One revealed the tragic irony of a brilliant scientist whose dedication to objective research had been corrupted by service to masters whose ideology demanded conclusions that science could not support. His development of Curling-13 represented genuine scientific achievement applied to morally indefensible objectives, creating weapons that could achieve unprecedented efficiency in mass murder, while maintaining the fiction that such actions served humanitarian purposes. The conversation between them exposed the intellectual dishonesty that had enabled an otherwise decent man to participate in projects that would have horrified him under different circumstances. The sabotage of the Curling-13 project required technical knowledge and moral courage that few individuals in the post-war world possessed in combination, but the Chosen One's journey had provided them with both the expertise necessary to understand the weapon's mechanisms and the motivation required to destroy it regardless of personal cost. The virus represented humanity's greatest threat and potentially its final mistake, a tool that could eliminate the genetic diversity that had enabled survival in post-war conditions, while establishing principles of racial purity that history had already proven to be both scientifically invalid and morally catastrophic. The reactor sabotage that would ultimately destroy the oil rig represented a desperate gambit that reflected both the magnitude of the threat that the Enclave posed and the limited options available for stopping their plans before they could be implemented. The Chosen One's technical skills, developed through exposure to various technologies during their wasteland travels, enabled them to understand the facility's power systems well enough to initiate an overload sequence that would result in complete destruction of the platform and everything aboard. The decision required accepting personal death as the probable cost of preventing global genocide, a calculation that revealed the moral clarity that had guided their entire quest. Tom Murray's cooperation in the reactor sabotage demonstrated how even loyal Enclave personnel could be forced to choose between their abstract ideological commitments and the immediate reality of nuclear annihilation. His position as head of the Atomic Energy Division had provided him with intimate knowledge of the platform's power systems, but it had also made him acutely aware of the catastrophic consequences that reactor failure would produce for everyone aboard. His assistance in implementing the overload sequence represented a last-minute conversion from blind loyalty to practical recognition that survival required abandoning the principles that had previously guided his career. The activation of the platform's self-destruct sequence transformed the oil rig from a center of scientific research and political planning into a mechanical countdown toward total destruction, with automated systems methodically shutting down non-essential functions while maintaining the reactor overload that would ensure complete elimination of all sensitive materials and personnel. The Enclave's security protocols, designed to prevent the compromise of their secrets even in the worst-case scenario of total defeat, were now working against their own survival as the platform's death throes began to accelerate toward their inevitable conclusion. The Chosen One's race toward the exit represented not just a desperate attempt at personal survival, but a mission to carry word of the Enclave's defeat back to the mainland communities that had unknowingly faced extinction at their hands. The knowledge they had gained about Curling 13, the scope of Enclave operations, and the methods used in their conspiracy would be essential for preventing similar threats in the future, while helping survivor communities understand the forces that had shaped their post-war existence. Their escape would transform them from unknown tribal emissary into historical figure whose actions had preserved the possibility of human recovery and development. But the oil rig's final defenses were not limited to automated systems and structural collapse, for the Enclave's ultimate weapon had been designed specifically to handle threats that conventional security measures could not contain. Frank Horrigan's emergence as the last guardian of Enclave interests represented the convergence of everything they had achieved in biological enhancement, technological integration, and ideological conditioning. His appearance in the path of the Chosen One's escape was not coincidental but inevitable, the final test that would determine whether their scientific and political vision could survive its ultimate challenge. Frank's arrival at the critical moment when the Chosen One believed their mission was complete revealed the depth of the Enclave's strategic planning and their understanding that even the most comprehensive security systems might eventually be compromised by sufficiently determined opposition. His role as the ultimate failsafe reflected their recognition that certain threats could only be eliminated through direct application of overwhelming force, guided by absolute loyalty to their cause. The confrontation that was about to unfold would determine not just the immediate fate of those involved, but the broader question of whether genetic purity enhanced through scientific intervention could triumph over the adaptive diversity that had enabled post-war survival. The psychological impact of Frank's appearance on the Chosen One was immediate and overwhelming, transforming what had seemed like a successful escape into recognition that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. His physical presence alone was sufficient to communicate the futility of conventional resistance, while his reputation as an unstoppable force had preceded him through wasteland folklore that painted him as something beyond normal human capacity for violence or endurance. The fear he inspired was not irrational terror, but educated recognition of facing capabilities that exceeded every assumption about what human enhancement could achieve. Frank's confidence in his ability to prevent the Chosen One's escape reflected not arrogance but accurate assessment of the tactical situation based on his enhanced capabilities and their demonstrated limitations. His integrated weapons systems provided firepower that exceeded anything they had previously encountered, while his armor offered protection that made their conventional armament essentially irrelevant to the outcome of direct confrontation. Most importantly, his psychological conditioning had prepared him for exactly this scenario, enabling him to function with perfect efficiency, even as the facility around them descended into chaos and imminent destruction. The meltdown that was beginning throughout the oil rig created environmental hazards that would have been fatal to normal humans. But Frank's enhanced physiology and integrated life support systems enabled him to function effectively, even as radiation levels climbed toward lethal concentrations and structural integrity began to fail throughout the platform. His ability to operate under these conditions provided him with tactical advantages that made the approaching destruction work in his favor rather than against his mission objectives. Frank's taunting of the Chosen One revealed both his complete confidence in the outcome of their confrontation and his psychological need to demonstrate the superiority of everything he represented over the contaminated specimens who had dared to challenge Enclave authority. His words carried not just personal animosity, but ideological conviction, expressing his absolute faith in the righteousness of his cause and the inevitability of his victory over forces that represented everything corrupt and degraded in post-war society. The realization that escape would require defeating Frank, rather than simply evading him, forced the Chosen One to confront the possibility that their mission might end in failure, despite their success in sabotaging the Curling 13 project and eliminating key Enclave leadership. The tactical situation seemed hopeless against an opponent whose capabilities exceeded every challenge they had previously overcome, but their journey had also provided them with allies, resources, and knowledge that might enable victory through methods that conventional military thinking could not encompass. The weapons and equipment that the Chosen One had acquired during their wasteland travels represented not just personal armament, but the accumulated technological heritage of multiple post-war civilizations, combining pre-war artifacts with innovative adaptations that reflected the ingenuity of communities that had learned to survive through resourcefulness rather than overwhelming force. Their arsenal was diverse and unconventional, offering possibilities for tactical approaches that Frank's enhancement might not have anticipated or prepared for. But more importantly, the Chosen One's journey had provided them with allies whose capabilities complemented their own limitations, creating tactical possibilities that individual action could never have achieved. The companions who had joined their mission brought specialized skills, advanced equipment, and personal motivations that would prove crucial in the confrontation that would determine whether the Enclave's vision of genetic purity would triumph over the adaptive diversity that had enabled post-war recovery. The facility's automated defense systems, originally designed to protect Enclave interests, could potentially be turned against their ultimate defender if the proper access codes and technical knowledge were available to redirect their targeting priorities. The Chosen One's infiltration had provided them with opportunities to acquire the administrative access that would enable such redirection, while their technical skills made it possible to implement the necessary system modifications under combat conditions. The environmental hazards created by the reactor meltdown, while dangerous to all organic life forms, might affect Frank's integrated systems differently than they would impact purely biological opponents, creating possibilities for tactical advantage if the Chosen One could exploit the differences between enhanced physiology and mechanical systems. The radiation, heat, and structural instability that made the facility increasingly dangerous might also interfere with Frank's equipment in ways that could be exploited by opponents who understood the vulnerabilities inherent in complex technological integration. Frank's psychological conditioning, while providing him with advantages in normal combat situations, might also create vulnerabilities that could be exploited by opponents who understood the limitations of absolute ideological commitment. His complete identification with Enclave values might prevent him from adapting to tactical situations that fell outside his operational parameters, while his emotional detachment might blind him to possibilities that required understanding of human motivations beyond simple loyalty to authority. The time pressure created by the accelerating meltdown would affect the tactical calculations of both combatants, but in ways that might favor quick thinking and adaptability over raw firepower and defensive capability. The Chosen One's experience with improvisation and resource management under extreme conditions might provide advantages that Frank's methodical approach to combat could not match, while the approaching destruction would limit the duration of engagement in ways that prevented Frank from fully utilizing his superior endurance and damage absorption capabilities. The confrontation that was about to unfold would test not just individual capabilities but the competing philosophies that had shaped post-war development, pitting genetic purity, enhanced through scientific control against adaptive diversity developed through environmental challenge. The outcome would determine whether humanity's future lay in the restoration of pre-war ideals or the continued evolution of new forms of civilization adapted to post-war realities. Frank Horrigan stood as the ultimate expression of one vision, while the Chosen One represented everything that the other path had achieved through decades of struggle, innovation, and moral development under impossible circumstances. The stage was set for the final battle that would determine not just their individual fates but the direction of human development for generations to come, with the dying oil rig serving as both arena and deadline for a confrontation that would test every assumption about strength, intelligence, and the moral authority that justified extreme action in service of competing visions of humanity's proper future. The moment of confrontation arrived with the inexorable weight of destiny, as two figures faced each other in the dying corridors of humanity's most ambitious fortress, while the ocean pressed against weakening walls and nuclear fire prepared to consume everything that generations of scientific achievement had built. Frank Horrigan stood like a monument to enhanced human potential, his massive form filling the passageway with mechanical precision and organic power that defied every assumption about the boundaries between flesh and steel. Across from him, the Chosen One represented everything the Enclave had sought to eliminate: adaptation born of necessity, strength forged through adversity, and the stubborn refusal to accept extinction that had enabled post-war survival against impossible odds. The tactical situation was overwhelming in Frank's favor, his enhanced physiology providing advantages that rendered conventional combat strategies obsolete, while his integrated weapons systems offered firepower that could devastate entire military units. His 999 points of structural integrity represented the absolute maximum that the Enclave's medical systems could measure, indicating durability that exceeded the specifications of their most advanced diagnostic equipment. His strength, agility, and endurance had been enhanced to the theoretical limits of biological possibility, while his intelligence remained sharp enough to apply these capabilities with tactical precision that combined brute force with strategic thinking. But the Chosen One's journey through the wasteland had provided them with resources that transcended simple military hardware, accumulating allies whose capabilities complemented their own limitations, while developing tactical approaches that relied on adaptability rather than overwhelming superiority. The companions who had joined their mission brought specialized knowledge, advanced equipment, and personal motivations that created possibilities for coordinated action against opponents whose individual capabilities might be insurmountable through direct confrontation. The presidential access card that had enabled the Chosen One's infiltration of Enclave leadership now provided opportunities for system manipulation that could potentially turn the facility's own defenses against its ultimate guardian. The oil rig's automated turret systems had been designed to protect against external threats, but their targeting parameters could be modified by someone with proper administrative access and sufficient technical knowledge to implement the necessary changes under combat conditions. Frank's initial assault demonstrated the overwhelming firepower that his integrated weapons systems could deliver, with plasma discharges that would have instantly vaporized normal opponents, while explosive rounds created craters in the reinforced corridors that surrounded their battlefield. His rate of fire exceeded anything that conventional weapons could achieve, while his targeting accuracy remained perfect despite the facility's increasing structural instability and the environmental hazards created by the approaching meltdown. The Chosen One's survival of Frank's opening barrage required every defensive capability they had developed during their wasteland travels, combining advanced armor with tactical movement that utilized the corridor's structural features to break line of sight while minimizing exposure to his overwhelming firepower. Their strategy could not rely on matching his offensive capabilities, but instead focused on exploiting the environmental advantages that the deteriorating facility provided for opponents who understood how to turn chaos into tactical opportunity. The redirection of the facility's defensive turrets against Frank represented the first tactical success that the Chosen One achieved in what had seemed like an impossible confrontation, demonstrating how administrative access and technical knowledge could overcome raw physical superiority when applied with precision and timing. The automated weapon systems that began targeting Frank rather than his opponents created confusion in his tactical calculations, while providing covering fire that enabled more aggressive maneuvering against his position. Frank's adaptation to the changed tactical situation revealed both his enhanced intelligence and his psychological conditioning, as he shifted from direct assault to more sophisticated approaches that utilized his superior mobility and defensive capabilities to neutralize the environmental advantages that his opponents were attempting to exploit. His integrated armor systems provided protection against the redirected turret fire, while his enhanced strength enabled him to physically destroy the automated weapons that had been turned against him. The structural damage that Frank's movements caused throughout the facility demonstrated the enormous forces involved in his enhanced physiology, with his footsteps creating cracks in reinforced flooring, while his weapons' discharges weakened support beams that had been designed to withstand conventional military assault. The environmental hazards that resulted from his presence worked against all combatants equally, but his superior durability and integrated life support systems provided him with significant advantages in the increasingly hostile conditions. The Chosen One's tactical approach evolved to focus on mobility and misdirection rather than direct engagement, utilizing their knowledge of the facility's layout to create opportunities for flanking attacks, while avoiding sustained exposure to Frank's overwhelming firepower. Their strategy required perfect timing and spatial awareness, as even minor mistakes in positioning or movement would result in immediate death from weapons that could eliminate entire squads of conventional soldiers with single shots. The allies who had accompanied the Chosen One into the facility provided crucial support that transformed an impossible individual confrontation into a coordinated team effort that could exploit Frank's limitations while minimizing their own vulnerabilities. Their diverse capabilities created tactical possibilities that single combat could never have achieved, with synchronized attacks that forced Frank to divide his attention while specialized equipment provided advantages that conventional armament could not deliver. The Granite Squad that could potentially be recruited to assist in the confrontation represented another tactical asset that proper preparation and diplomatic skill could bring to bear against Frank's seemingly insurmountable advantages. These Enclave personnel, whose loyalty had been shaken by the revelation of their leadership's true intentions, could provide both additional firepower and intimate knowledge of Frank's capabilities that would enable more effective tactical planning against his integrated systems. Frank's response to coordinated opposition demonstrated his evolution from enhanced individual into living weapons platform, whose capabilities had been specifically designed to handle multiple opponents simultaneously. His rate of fire increased to accommodate additional targets, while his targeting systems automatically prioritized threats based on their immediate danger to his mission objectives. The tactical sophistication of his responses revealed intelligence that had been enhanced rather than diminished by his physical transformation. The environmental conditions within the facility continued to deteriorate as the reactor meltdown progressed, creating atmospheric hazards that affected all organic systems while generating electromagnetic interference that could potentially disrupt the electronic components integrated into Frank's enhanced physiology. The radiation levels that would prove fatal to normal humans within minutes provided opportunities for tactical advantage if the Chosen One could exploit the differences between purely biological systems and the hybrid technology that sustained Frank's continued function. The heat generated by the failing reactor systems created thermal gradients that interfered with targeting systems while making prolonged combat increasingly difficult for all participants. But Frank's integrated cooling systems provided him with advantages that enabled sustained high-intensity operations under conditions that would incapacitate normal opponents. His ability to maintain peak performance despite the environmental stress demonstrated the thoroughness of his enhancement and the sophistication of the life support systems that had been integrated into his armor. The time pressure created by the accelerating meltdown affected the tactical calculations of all combatants, but in ways that potentially favored quick adaptation over methodical application of superior firepower. The Chosen One's experience with improvisation under extreme conditions might provide advantages that Frank's systematic approach to combat could not match, while the approaching destruction limited engagement duration in ways that prevented full utilization of his superior endurance and damage absorption capabilities. Frank's psychological conditioning began to show signs of stress as the confrontation continued beyond his operational parameters, with the unexpected effectiveness of coordinated opposition challenging his absolute confidence in Enclave superiority, while the facility's destruction threatened the mission objectives that defined his entire existence. His enhanced intelligence recognized the tactical problems that he was facing, but his ideological programming prevented him from considering solutions that might require acknowledging the legitimacy of his opponent's cause. The ammunition and energy reserves that sustained Frank's overwhelming firepower represented finite resources that could potentially be exhausted through prolonged engagement, creating opportunities for tactical advantage if the Chosen One could survive long enough to force him into resource management decisions. His integrated systems required constant power for optimal performance, and the facility's deteriorating power grid might affect his capabilities in ways that could be exploited by opponents who understood the vulnerabilities inherent in complex technological integration. The cumulative damage that Frank absorbed during the extended confrontation began to affect his performance in subtle ways that created opportunities for more aggressive tactical approaches by his opponents. His armor systems showed signs of stress from repeated impacts, while his mobility decreased incrementally as structural damage accumulated in his integrated mechanical components. The invulnerability that had characterized his early operations was revealing itself to be extraordinary durability rather than complete immunity to damage. The moment when Frank's integrated systems began to show signs of critical failure marked the turning point in a confrontation that had seemed hopeless from its beginning, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated enhancement could be overwhelmed by sufficient determination and tactical innovation. His weapon systems experienced power fluctuations that affected their rate of fire, while his targeting accuracy decreased as damage accumulated in his sensory apparatus and processing centers. Frank's realization that he might actually lose the confrontation triggered psychological responses that his conditioning had not adequately prepared him for, creating internal conflicts between his programmed loyalty and his enhanced survival instincts. His absolute faith in Enclave superiority was being challenged by empirical evidence that contaminated specimens could possess capabilities that exceeded his own in certain tactical situations, forcing him to confront possibilities that his worldview had dismissed as impossible. The critical damage that finally compromised Frank's combat effectiveness came not from any single devastating attack, but from the accumulated effects of sustained tactical pressure, applied with precision and coordination that exploited every vulnerability in his seemingly impregnable defenses. His integrated armor began to fail in cascade patterns that created opportunities for more effective attacks, while his mechanical systems showed signs of the wear that even enhanced materials could not indefinitely resist. Frank's continued defiance, even as his physical systems approached total failure, demonstrated the depth of his psychological conditioning and his absolute identification with the cause he had served throughout his enhanced existence. His threats and taunts maintained their intensity despite his deteriorating condition, reflecting his inability to accept that forces he considered inferior could prove superior in any meaningful contest of capability or will. The final moments of Frank's existence were marked by system failures that revealed the extent to which his enhancement had blurred the boundaries between organic and mechanical function, with his death involving not just biological cessation, but technological shutdown that affected every aspect of his integrated physiology. His armor split along stress fractures that exposed the organic components beneath, while his helmet systems experienced catastrophic failure that made his final words barely comprehensible through damaged communication equipment. Frank's last expression of loyalty to the Enclave reflected his fundamental inability to question the ideology that had shaped his entire existence, maintaining his faith in their cause, even as his death marked the ultimate failure of everything they had worked to achieve. His final words carried not regret or doubt, but continued defiance, expressing his conviction that their vision would ultimately triumph despite this temporary setback caused by forces that had proven more resourceful than anticipated. The explosion that marked Frank's final destruction scattered the remains of his enhanced physiology throughout the corridor, where humanity's ultimate weapon had made his last stand against opponents who represented everything he had been created to eliminate. The silence that followed his death was broken only by the increasing sounds of structural failure as the facility continued its descent toward total destruction, but the immediate threat that he had posed was ended forever. The Chosen One's survival of the confrontation with Frank Horrigan represented not just personal victory, but validation of the adaptive approach to post-war survival that had enabled the development of diverse communities despite the harsh conditions that followed nuclear devastation. Their success demonstrated that individual superiority, however extreme, could be overcome by coordinated effort, guided by tactical innovation and moral commitment that transcended personal survival instincts. The tactical lessons learned during the confrontation would influence post-war military thinking for generations, proving that even the most advanced enhancement could be defeated by opponents who understood how to exploit the vulnerabilities inherent in complex systems while applying coordinated pressure that exceeded the design parameters of individual capabilities. Frank's defeat marked not just the end of his personal threat, but the demonstration that Enclave technological superiority was not insurmountable when challenged by the collective capabilities of communities that had learned to survive through cooperation rather than domination. The facility's final destruction, which would eliminate all evidence of the Enclave's most ambitious projects, while scattering their carefully preserved genetic heritage across the ocean floor, represented the ultimate failure of their vision for post-war reconstruction based on principles of racial purity and technological control. Frank's death had removed their ultimate weapon, But more importantly, it had proven that their fundamental assumptions about genetic superiority were flawed in ways that no amount of scientific enhancement could correct. The silence that followed Frank Horrigan's destruction was not the peaceful quiet of resolution, but the hollow emptiness that accompanies the end of legends, when forces that seemed eternal and unchangeable are suddenly revealed to be as mortal as everything else that draws breath in the wasteland. The echo of his final words, that defiant cry of Semper Fi, lingered in the collapsing corridors like a ghost refusing to accept its own banishment, while the smoke from his obliterated remains mixed with the radioactive steam that marked the oil rig's descent toward its inevitable grave beneath the Pacific waves. Frank's death represented more than the elimination of a single threat or the conclusion of a specific military engagement. It marked the symbolic end of an entire worldview that had shaped post-war politics since the bombs first fell over 2 centuries earlier. The Enclave's vision of genetic purity enforced through technological supremacy had found its ultimate expression in his enhanced form, and his defeat demonstrated the fundamental flaws in assumptions that had guided their planning for generations. The perfect fusion of human intelligence and mechanical capability had proven vulnerable to the same forces that had enabled post-war survival, adaptability, cooperation, and the stubborn refusal to accept extinction that characterized communities forged through shared hardship. The broader implications of Frank's destruction extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory that the Chosen One had achieved through desperate courage and tactical innovation. His defeat proved that the Enclave's technological advantages, however impressive, were not sufficient to overcome organized resistance guided by moral clarity and supported by diverse communities that had learned to function through mutual aid rather than hierarchical domination. The weapon that had been designed to eliminate genetic contamination had instead become the ultimate argument against the possibility of human purity in a world where survival required adaptation to conditions that changed the very definition of what it meant to be human. Frank Horrigan's legacy in the wasteland would be complex and contradictory, remembered simultaneously as the ultimate expression of pre-war military power and the final proof that such power could not guarantee victory against opponents who understood the value of cooperation over domination. His reputation as an unstoppable force had inspired genuine terror among communities that recognized their vulnerability to capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. But his defeat would inspire hope that even the most overwhelming advantages could be overcome by determination, guided by moral conviction. The tactical lessons derived from Frank's final confrontation would influence military thinking throughout the post-war world, demonstrating that individual superiority, however extreme, could be neutralized by coordinated action that exploited the vulnerabilities inherent in complex systems. His integrated enhancement had made him incredibly powerful, but it had also created dependencies on technological systems that could be disrupted by opponents who understood how to apply pressure at critical points. The same sophistication that had made him nearly invulnerable had also introduced failure modes that simpler systems would not have experienced. But perhaps more significantly, Frank's story served as a cautionary tale about the corruption of loyalty when directed toward causes that demanded the abandonment of moral consideration for fellow human beings. His absolute dedication to the Enclave had enabled them to transform him into the perfect instrument for implementing policies that would have resulted in global genocide, demonstrating how virtues like service and sacrifice could be perverted when applied without critical examination of the principles they were meant to serve. His loyalty had been genuine and complete, but it had been directed toward objectives that revealed the inadequacy of loyalty alone as a guide for moral action. Frank's transformation from human agent into enhanced weapon represented the ultimate expression of the Enclave's philosophical approach to post-war reconstruction, which sought to preserve pre-war ideals through methods that betrayed everything those ideals had originally represented. His enhancement had preserved his intelligence and strengthened his physical capabilities, but it had also systematically eliminated the empathy and moral flexibility that might have enabled him to question the righteousness of orders that required the elimination of entire populations. He had become the perfect soldier for a cause that demanded perfect soldiers, willing to commit perfect atrocities in service of imperfect ideals. The psychological profile that had made Frank ideal for Enclave service, his emotional detachment, his capacity for violence, and his absolute loyalty to authority, had been enhanced along with his physical capabilities, creating a being whose moral reasoning was constrained by parameters that prevented consideration of alternatives to the worldview that had shaped his entire existence. His inability to question Enclave ideology, even when confronted with evidence of its failures, demonstrated how enhancement could reinforce existing limitations as effectively as it overcame physical ones. Frank's role as the public face of Enclave power had created a mythology that transcended his individual capabilities, transforming him into a symbol that represented both the promise and the threat of scientific enhancement applied to human development. Communities that had never encountered him personally knew his reputation through stories that grew more terrifying with each retelling, creating psychological effects that served Enclave interests, even when Frank himself was not present to enforce their will through direct action. The fear that Frank had inspired among wasteland populations was not irrational terror, but educated recognition of facing capabilities that redefined the boundaries of human potential in ways that challenged every assumption about what individuals could accomplish through determination and superior equipment. His presence on any battlefield was sufficient to alter tactical calculations and strategic planning, forcing opponents to consider scenarios that fell outside normal military thinking while acknowledging that conventional approaches to conflict resolution would be inadequate against his enhanced capabilities. But Frank's defeat had transformed that fear into something more complex and ultimately more valuable for post-war development. The recognition that even the most overwhelming individual advantages could be overcome by communities that understood how to function as coordinated entities rather than collections of competing individuals. His destruction had proven that cooperation could triumph over enhancement, that moral conviction could overcome technological superiority, and that the adaptive diversity which the Enclave had sought to eliminate was actually humanity's greatest strength for surviving challenges that required innovative solutions. The contrast between Frank Horrigan and other significant antagonists in post-war history revealed different approaches to the fundamental problems of survival and reconstruction in a world damaged by nuclear warfare. Where the Master had sought to transform humanity into something new through forced evolution, Frank had represented the attempt to preserve humanity's past through selective enhancement and systematic elimination of contamination. Both approaches had failed, but for different reasons that illuminated the complexities of post-war existence and the inadequacy of simple solutions to problems that required nuanced understanding of human nature and social development. Frank's scientific enhancement had made him superior to normal humans in every measurable category, but it had not provided him with the wisdom necessary to understand that his own enhancement was evidence against the Enclave's fundamental assumptions about genetic purity and human development. His existence proved that mutation could be beneficial when properly directed, that technological integration could enhance rather than diminish human capability, and that the boundaries between pure and contaminated genetic material were far more fluid than Enclave ideology acknowledged. The tragic irony of Frank's situation was that he embodied everything the Enclave claimed to value while simultaneously disproving the theoretical foundations upon which their policies were based. His loyalty, intelligence, and capability represented the best qualities of human nature enhanced through scientific intervention, but his willingness to commit genocide in service of genetic purity demonstrated the moral bankruptcy that resulted when such enhancement was guided by ideological fanaticism rather than ethical consideration for the welfare of all human beings. Frank's inability to recognize himself as a mutant, despite his obvious transformation, revealed the power of psychological conditioning to override empirical evidence when that evidence conflicted with fundamental beliefs about identity and purpose. His self-perception as the ultimate expression of human purity was maintained through cognitive mechanisms that prevented him from acknowledging the contradictions between his enhanced nature and the Enclave's stated objectives regarding genetic contamination. The communities that had suffered under Frank's operations would remember him as a force of nature rather than a human being, their accounts emphasizing his overwhelming power and absolute ruthlessness, while struggling to comprehend the intelligence and tactical sophistication that had made him so effective as an instrument of Enclave policy. These memories would serve as warnings about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of maintaining moral limitations on the application of superior force, even when that force was directed toward objectives that seemed to serve legitimate security interests. Frank's legacy for future enhancement projects would be complex and cautionary, demonstrating both the potential for scientific intervention to create capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations, and the risks involved in applying such enhancement without adequate consideration for the moral and psychological consequences of transcending natural boundaries. His success as a weapon had validated the theoretical approaches that the Enclave had pursued, but his ultimate defeat had revealed the strategic limitations of relying on individual superiority rather than building sustainable institutions capable of maintaining power through legitimacy rather than terror. The technical knowledge that had enabled Frank's transformation would survive his death in the form of research records and scientific personnel who had participated in his enhancement, creating possibilities for future projects that might avoid the mistakes that had led to his destruction while building upon the genuine achievements that his development had represented. But the moral lessons of his story would be equally important for guiding such future efforts, demonstrating the necessity of maintaining ethical constraints on enhancement projects that might otherwise create beings whose capabilities exceeded their wisdom or moral development. Frank's relationship with the concept of humanity itself had been fundamentally altered by his enhancement, transforming him from a member of the human community into something that existed in an ambiguous space between human and post-human identity. His loyalty to human ideals had been preserved and intensified, but his capacity for human empathy had been systematically eliminated to create a being that could serve human interests as defined by his handlers, while remaining incapable of independent moral reasoning about the legitimacy of those interests. The question of whether Frank retained sufficient humanity to be considered morally responsible for his actions would occupy post-war philosophers and legal theorists for generations, raising fundamental questions about the relationship between enhancement and moral agency that would become increasingly relevant as scientific capabilities continued to develop. His absolute loyalty to the Enclave might have been the result of psychological conditioning that reduced his moral autonomy below the threshold necessary for full responsibility, or it might have represented a conscious choice to subordinate individual judgment to collective authority in ways that enhanced rather than diminished his moral culpability. Frank's story served as a warning about the seductive appeal of simple solutions to complex problems, demonstrating how the promise of technological superiority could blind even intelligent individuals to the moral costs of pursuing objectives that required the abandonment of ethical consideration for those deemed inferior or contaminated. His enhancement had provided him with capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations, but it had not equipped him with the wisdom necessary to understand that such capabilities created moral obligations rather than eliminating them. The broader implications of Frank's existence for understanding human potential in the post-war world suggested both optimistic and pessimistic possibilities for future development. His enhancement had proven that human beings could be improved far beyond their natural limitations when such improvement was guided by scientific knowledge and unlimited resources. But his defeat had demonstrated that such improvement was insufficient to guarantee success when applied without consideration for the social and moral contexts that ultimately determined the effectiveness of individual capabilities. The communities that would inherit the post-enclave world would face choices about human enhancement that were informed by both the promise represented by Frank's capabilities and the dangers illustrated by his ultimate failure. The scientific knowledge that had created him remained available for future applications that might avoid the ideological constraints that had prevented him from questioning the righteousness of his mission, but that same knowledge could also be applied toward objectives that shared the Enclave's fundamental disregard for human welfare when such welfare conflicted with abstract principles of genetic or cultural purity. Frank Horrigan's final legacy was not his individual story, but the questions his existence raised about the relationship between power and responsibility, between capability and wisdom, between loyalty and independence, that would shape human development for as long as the species continued to seek improvement through scientific intervention. His death had ended one chapter in the ongoing story of post-war recovery and reconstruction, but it had also opened new chapters that would test humanity's ability to learn from the mistakes of the past, while building toward a future that preserved the best qualities of human nature without repeating the errors that had nearly led to extinction. The wasteland that Frank had terrorized would slowly heal from the wounds his presence had inflicted, but the memory of what he had represented would serve as a permanent reminder that human potential, however enhanced, remained subject to the moral limitations that defined the boundary between civilization and barbarism. His story would be told and retold in the settlements that had survived his operations, becoming part of the folklore that preserved essential truths about power and its responsibilities across generations that might otherwise forget the costs of abandoning ethical consideration in pursuit of seemingly righteous objectives. In the end, Frank Horrigan stood as both the ultimate achievement and the ultimate failure of pre-war thinking applied to post-war problems, a monument to human ingenuity and human folly that would serve future generations as both inspiration and warning about the choices that would determine whether the species continued to evolve toward greater wisdom or repeated the mistakes that had already brought civilization to the brink of permanente extinction. And so ends the chronicle of Frank Horrigan, the Enclave's perfect weapon and most tragic creation. From loyal servant to mutated monster, from protector to destroyer, his tale reminds us that even the strongest loyalty can be corrupted by the wrong cause. In the wasteland's endless story of survival and sacrifice, Frank stands as a monument to the dangers of blind obedience and the price of becoming the very thing you claim to fight against. His legend lives on in whispered stories around wasteland campfires, a reminder that sometimes the greatest monsters are not born from chaos, but from order taken too far. Rest now, knowing that in dreams at least, the wasteland is free from those who would remake it in their own image, and that even the mightiest weapons must eventually fall to those who fight for something greater than themselves. Sleep peacefully, wanderer, and let Frank's story fade into the gentle darkness of slumber.